Oki. Nixokoa. Hello, all my relations. My name is Diana, aka Mama Rudegang of Rudegang Entertainment. After connecting with so many Indigenous hip hop artists across Canada, it's clear that there is so much to explore. And these days, people want to know, what is Indigenous hip hop? And why are so many Indigenous youth attracted to hip hop culture? Join us as we discuss these very questions with Indigenous hip hop artists from the first wave and the new. This is The Foundation.
When I was listening to Ice-T and he was talking about kids crying 6 in the morning in South Central, it made me look at the social problems that was going on in my own community.
It catches your ear right off the bat because it's different, but then it still sounds like hip hop.
Hip hop is it's like oration.
Indigenous culture across the board really goes hand in hand with hip hop culture.
They see that we have a message and it's important.
It's life. It's everything.
It's our generation's voice, and being Indigenous, we have something to say.
Lord to the Bannock, Bannock to the Lord. Something is hard to Sean Bernard.
Native hip hop.
Indigenous hip hop is home to many amazing and beautiful individuals. There have always been Indigenous artists gloriously occupying space in every corner of the culture. DJs, dancers, graffiti artists, and of course, MCs. The very first Indigenous hip-hop artists were from the USA and were active as far back as the 1970s. Melly Mel, one of the original creators of hip-hop culture itself, a Cherokee man. Ernie Paniccioli, arguably hip-hop's most valuable photographer of all time, a Krew man. 1989 gave us the Indian in the cupboard himself, Lightfoot, of Cherokee and Chichimeca descent. In the early to mid-90s, Canada finally had Indigenous hip-hop artists to call her own. War Party, Oz 12, Equal, and KINNIE STARR, who in 1997 was signed to Def Jam Records. Since the year 2000, the number of Indigenous hip-hop artists across Canada has shot through the roof, with now classic groups like Rezofficial, Rapture Rising, and Winnipeg's Most carving a path for the new wave.
When I came up, I had nobody around me that was a rapper. I'd have to battle myself. Rapping got me introduced to SMALLBOY. The rest is history.
Back then, there was still discrimination, within our communities and the non-native communities. How it felt to be native, there was like a stigma attached to it. In fact, I had a lot of friends that were ashamed to be native. And Chuck D, seeing how he was making black people want to be more themselves, he made black people feel proud and feel good to be black people. When I listened to Chuck D, that made me want to feel more good about being Indian. So I thought, I wanna be like that guy for my people.
Me and Alita started when there wasn't a thing called Indigenous hip hop. There was a few of us who were doing it. It wasn't until later when SMALLBOY said
Native hip hop
on Rap City that genre popped up.
Native hip hop. The term suggests a deliberate separation from the hip hop most people are familiar with. But is it really that different? Is there a separation? Indigenous nations across Turtle Island each have a rich, vibrant culture and long, storied history.
I knew that I was an Indigenous person, but I didn't necessarily know where we came from in our stories. We live through oral traditions. That's the way we are. We're not necessarily writing things down from time immemorial. It was always just talking. So to know that we were carrying on tradition, our tradition that way, I was like, man, that's how we've always been.
Yeah. Pray for me. Political, pray for me. There's not enough money to...
More and more often these days, we're seeing the ways that young Indigenous artists are using hip-hop to challenge the system by pointing out its faults and the many ways that it impacts the lives of Indigenous people.
As Indigenous youth within Canada, like the system was built for us to fail. And the way that we were made to think about ourselves and the way that our peers made us think about ourselves, it wasn't built for us to succeed.
Indigenous people who have just been silenced for years, and now people are listening.
My mother was a survivor of the residential school, and we still have that building standing as a reminder on our Tecumseh Reserve. And being Indigenous and reclaiming that is so important. Like, my mom never learned to speak our language again. So just reclaiming that within the aspect of hip hop, right? Because hip hop is the language of our generation. It's the music of our generation. It's our voice.
The history of Canada tells us of genocidal forces unleashed upon the first people of Turtle Island. Disease, starvation, the Indian Act, residential schools, the 60s scoop, the millennial scoop, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. The effects of colonization continue to echo through Indigenous communities across Turtle Island.
After the Oka crisis, there is a lot of anguish that was happening.
Especially because of the residential schools, colonization, addictions running strong in our communities, trauma. There's so much trauma.
There were so many closed doors, so many blockages, so many things saying no. Don't speak, little Indian. You know, don't say nothing.
We were silenced. We were told that we weren't allowed to speak our own language. We're now forced to speak English. And so we're screaming it into the mic.
I'm a red man heading for the res man. Native got creative, now my status is ahead.
As Indigenous people, we find resiliency in our cultural ways. Our ancestors, our stories, our laughter, and our music.
Indigenous people are artists, whether it's poetry, painting, or whatever. Like, so many youth have some sort of talent in them. And I think maybe hip hop is like one of the fastest, easiest ways to express themselves.
Growing up in an environment where like culture and like your family and your roots are important, seeing like idols such as the Snotty Nose Res Kid making a wave and making it like cool.
It's our medicine. It's our council fires, and sometimes we can't sit at the regular council fires, or we can't sit at the table with the elders, and so we went into the streets, or we went into community halls, or behind the community halls, or in a parking lot of these halls, and we created these vibes in these communities. And so it's a place for us to figure things out.
So, what is Indigenous hip hop? Is it a culture of its own? Or is it simply the community that Indigenous people create for themselves within the existing world of hip hop?
I don't like the term native hip hop because that pigeonholes us. We are hip hop.
To me, it's a bit limiting at times, Indigenous hip hop. But hip hop has Indigenous roots.
And it goes back to like traditions of oration. Hip hop is like, it's like oration, what it would have been, you know, hundreds of years ago.
Indigenous culture and hip hop culture kind of go hand in hand.
You think of like the culture of hip hop, they have the MCs. Indigenous culture, we have our storytellers. Hip hop, we got the B-boys. Our culture, we have the powwow dancers. Hip hop, you got the DJ, we got our drummers. You got the graffiti artists in hip hop, we have our carvers, we have our painters, we have our beaters.
The background of hip hop really comes from a place of oppression, and us as Indigenous youth across Turtle Island right now are feeling that.
Whatever nation that you're from have a history of their own form of government and their own way of learning. If you tap into that and learn how your people used to learn, it's most likely that you're gonna come out on top that way.
I feel the same way every day, man. Listen, yeah, but you gotta understand, all my native people, that's why we gotta